The announcement lasted less than 3 minutes, yet it left the royal household frozen in disbelief. Inside a sealed chamber at Balmoral, a decree bearing Queen Elizabeth's private mark was read aloud. Prince George would inherit a hidden Highland estate, reserved for the crown's future guardian. Charles lowered his eyes. William stopped breathing. And the young prince suddenly found himself carrying a legacy no one had prepared him to receive. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Silence tightened around the table. Charles remained still, while Camilla watched the senior estate trustee unfold the final page. William glanced toward Catherine, but she was already looking at George. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish residence, had witnessed painful meetings before, yet this gathering carried a different danger. It concerned not only property, but control over the child expected to stand near the center of Britain's future monarchy. The trustee cleared his throat and named the inheritance without hesitation. George had been given Glencormac, a vast Highland estate personally owned by the late Queen, together with its main house, surrounding land, private archive, and ceremonial guardianship rights. A decree was a formal written command carrying legal authority, and this one had been sealed during the monarch's final years. That mattered, because the estate now belonged outside ordinary palace control, leaving the family unable to alter the decision through preference or pressure. George turned immediately toward William. Confusion crossed the boy's face as he waited for his father to explain why no one had prepared him. The prince tried to answer, but nothing came. He had never heard the name Glencormac before that morning. Catherine reached beneath the table and took her son's hand. He held on tightly, exposing the fear behind his controlled expression. Charles leaned closer to the page. Beneath the inheritance clause, he found a handwritten restriction stating that the estate must pass directly to George without control from the reigning sovereign, the Queen Consort, or the Prince of Wales. The king read the sentence twice. Each reading made the exclusion feel more personal, because his mother had protected the property not only from strangers, but from those closest to the throne. Camilla finally broke the silence through a direct question recorded in the trustee's documented account of the meeting. She asked whether the decree could be reviewed. Anne moved the paper beyond her reach and answered that the Queen's wording allowed no reinterpretation. The Queen Consort stiffened, while the Princess Royal kept one hand firmly over the document. George rose, approached the sealed envelope, and asked, "Why did she choose me?" No one answered. Then the trustee revealed that Glencormac had never been merely a retreat. The Queen had created it to protect something she believed could preserve the monarchy, or divide it forever. But before George could understand what he had inherited, he first had to understand why every adult in the room seemed afraid of it. George had been raised to expect duty, ceremony, and sacrifice. He had not been raised to expect suspicion from his own family. Within hours of the decree, every glance carried a hidden meaning. William saw a son placed too close to the machinery of power. Catherine saw a childhood beginning to disappear. Charles saw his mother's final judgment. And Camilla saw a royal possession forever beyond her reach. William found Catherine near the Balmoral library and closed the door. He told her his fear was not Glencormac, but what others would make of it. George was second in line to the throne, meaning only his father stood between him and the crown, and the estate now gave him independent property before adulthood. Courtiers could begin treating a child as a separate center of influence. Catherine listened as the prince admitted he could guide their son, but could not legally claim the estate for him. The inheritance sat outside the normal chain of royal control, the line through which the sovereign and senior household direct property and duty. She understood the danger. Their son could gain authority while losing the freedom to be young. Charles carried a different wound. Alone with Anne, he confessed, through a documented account preserved by the trustee, that his mother had trusted her great-grandson with something she had never entrusted to him. The king did not sound angry. He sounded abandoned. Anne reminded him that trust was not always affection. Sometimes it was protection, shaped by fear. George sat beside Catherine in a quiet corridor and remembered the late Queen warning him never to accept a gift without asking what responsibility came with it. His mother squeezed his shoulder, but he kept staring ahead. The estate felt less like an inheritance and more like a test he had never agreed to take. Camilla approached, knelt beside him, and offered to help him understand Glen Cormac. Before George could answer, William appeared and calmly said the matter would remain within his immediate family. The queen consort rose slowly. She said nothing, yet the rejection landed with force. Anne examined the decree again and found 3 names barred from influencing the estate's management. A royal wax seal, a stamped mark protecting confidential wording, covered the final name. She also learned that Glen Cormac held a private council room, a locked stone archive, and a ceremonial chair made for an heir not yet sovereign. Charles ordered the trustee to explain when the arrangement began. His answer pointed toward one bitter family confrontation. The estate had not been left to George out of sentiment alone. It had been born from a moment the palace had spent years trying to bury. Every inheritance has an origin, but Glen Cormac's began with betrayal. 3 years before the Queen's death, a private Highland ceremony ended in a confrontation so severe that 2 royal cars left before midnight and 1 bedroom remained locked until morning. It was during those silent hours that the monarch reached for her writing desk, summoned her most trusted solicitor, and began separating the estate from everyone except a child. Glen Cormac had never been a royal retreat. Queen Elizabeth had purchased it as a refuge where family records, Highland customs, and letters could remain beyond palace administration. That mattered because palace offices could redirect property and access when reigns changed, while personal ownership allowed her to preserve memory and control. George had visited the estate twice as a boy. The Queen walked with him among tenant homes and explained stewardship, the duty to protect land and people rather than simply possess them. She told him that ownership without responsibility became greed. He remembered the lesson. She remembered his attention. Tension broke during the Glen Cormac harvest ceremony. Camilla proposed transferring the estate into a centralized royal trust controlled by Charles's future household, arguing that private properties should serve the next sovereign's priorities. A royal trust is a legal structure that manages assets for an agreed purpose, and her plan would have placed the Highland refuge under the coming king's authority. The Queen rejected the proposal before Charles, Camilla, Anne, and William. When her son asked whether she doubted his judgment, she answered, "I doubt what power makes people forget." The words struck harder than anger. Camilla placed her untouched glass on the table and walked out. Charles followed, shutting the door hard enough to shake the silver frame holding George's childhood photograph. William remained behind and apologized. The monarch studied him, then asked whether he would protect George from the crown if the crown ever demanded too much. The prince promised he would, though he did not understand why she was asking. Night settled, but the Queen did not sleep. According to Sir Alistair Hume's documented account, she summoned him without informing the palace secretariat, the office that coordinates royal business. Before dawn, she dictated the first draft of the decree. It would give George more than land. It would create an independent sanctuary, where a future heir could think, act, and breathe beyond pressure from the reigning household. Charles understood the inheritance as a rebuke. He demanded a private meeting with William before George entered the estate. What began as the Queen's protection of a child was about to become a confrontation between a king and the son who refused to surrender him. The door closed with no aides, no secretaries, and no witnesses. Only Charles and William, standing between a dead queen's wishes and a living boy's future. The king wanted order, the prince wanted protection. Neither raised his voice at first, yet every carefully chosen word carried years of unresolved pain, until one sentence transformed the inheritance dispute into a battle over who truly understood the cost of the crown. Charles began with duty. He argued that George was still a minor and could not oversee tenants, private archives, ceremonial rites, and a large estate without direct supervision from the sovereign's household. The sovereign's household is the working office that supports the reigning monarch and manages official royal responsibilities. To him, leaving Glen Cormac beyond that system created confusion, risk, and a dangerous gap in authority. William answered without hesitation. He reminded his father that the decree had already created a trusteeship, a legal arrangement in which appointed guardians manage property for someone else until that person is ready. The prince said the Queen had not forgotten oversight. She had simply chosen oversight that did not belong to Charles. The king pushed the decree across the table and asked whether his son truly intended to enforce restrictions written against his own father. William did not touch it. He said the restrictions were not an insult to be erased, but a promise to George that had to survive pressure from the crown itself. Charles insisted he was trying to stop the boy from becoming isolated by special treatment. William's expression hardened. He accused the monarch of confusing control with protection, then warned that surrounding George with fear would isolate him far faster than any estate ever could. The argument broke open when Charles proposed delaying access until George reached adulthood. William stepped forward and said his son would not be taught that a royal promise could disappear whenever it became inconvenient. The words struck deeply. The king removed his glasses, set them down, and admitted that the decree made him feel judged by his mother from beyond the grave. William revealed, through Anne's documented account of the sealed papers, that she held a second letter explaining why the sovereign had been excluded. Charles demanded it immediately. Outside the room, however, George heard only one sentence through the heavy door. The boy cannot be allowed to become a rival center of loyalty. George walked away before hearing William reject the idea. Minutes later, Catherine found his corridor completely empty, and quiet panic moved through Balmoral. While Charles and William fought over the meaning of the decree, George began to believe the inheritance had already turned him against his family. Glen Cormac belonged to George, but ownership was only the surface. Beneath the inheritance sat a hidden structure of trustees, restrictions, and carefully chosen guardians, designed to survive personal pressure from any future monarch. The Queen had anticipated resistance. She had predicted the arguments, and as Anne opened the second letter before Charles, it became clear that the late sovereign had built a wall around the young prince, long before anyone knew he needed one. Anne read slowly, refusing to let the tension rush her. The estate would remain under an independent Highland trust until George turned 25, preventing any royal household from selling it, reshaping it, or absorbing it into another property. A trust is a legal arrangement in which chosen people protect and manage assets for someone else. That mattered because even the king could not rewrite the estate's purpose through palace authority. Charles listened as his sister named the three guardians: Anne, William, and Malcolm Fraser, a Scottish trustee whose family had managed Glen Cormac's tenant agreements for decades. The monarch's expression remained guarded until the letter described George as a future king who must first be allowed to remain a boy. Then something changed. His shoulders lowered, and the anger in his face gave way to pain. Anne paused, folded the page, and told Charles that their mother had feared Glen Cormac would become another weapon in palace competition if it remained under sovereign control. The Princess Royal's words came from the Queen's signed account attached to the letter, leaving no doubt about their source. The king looked toward the closed door, suddenly aware that George had heard fear where protection had been intended. Camilla entered before anyone could continue. She objected to being excluded from discussions affecting the monarchy's future, but Anne answered without softening her tone. The decree did not reduce the queen consort's position. It restricted everyone equally where George was concerned. Camilla held her silence, though the answer clearly wounded her. Malcolm then revealed, through the trust's recorded inventory, that Glen Cormac's stone archive could only be opened with 2 keys. The Queen had held one. The second had been concealed inside a ceremonial object sent to George years earlier. Catherine immediately remembered the small silver compass the monarch had given him after his first Highland visit. William retrieved it and turned the backing carefully. Beneath the royal crest rested a narrow key, along with a tiny inscription pointing toward the estate chapel. The Queen's power had never depended on sentiment alone. Precise ownership, independent trusteeship, and a succession clause, a rule activating control after death, had made her decision almost impossible to overturn. The decree had survived its first challenge, but its victory came at a cost, and the consequences were already tearing through the family. By morning, the inheritance had changed the rhythm of Balmoral. Staff whispered behind service doors. Advisors canceled meetings. Charles refused breakfast. Camilla remained in her rooms. William searched the grounds for George, carrying the unbearable knowledge that his son had heard the worst sentence but not the defense that followed. The Queen's decree had protected the boy legally. Emotionally, however, it had left him standing alone inside a family at war. Charles acted first. He postponed every public engagement and ordered palace lawyers to stop discussing challenges until George was found, before another damaging word was spoken. That mattered because any continued legal pressure would make the boy feel hunted, while the king's silence could prevent a private wound from becoming a public crisis. The monarch finally understood that authority meant nothing if his grandson no longer felt safe inside the family. Camilla received her own blow. Glenn Cormac's staff, budget, archives, and public messaging would operate independently from her household, leaving the queen consort with no ceremonial role there. A ceremonial role is an official place in royal events without direct governing power, and losing it signaled that the estate would remain visibly separate from her influence. She sat beside an untouched tea tray and told Charles that her wish to help had been treated like intrusion. Charles did not defend the arrangement or challenge her pain. He said this was no longer about her exclusion or his authority. They had frightened a child who had never asked to become the center of a constitutional struggle, a conflict over how royal power should be controlled. Camilla looked away, then admitted that George's silence frightened her more than the decree. William found him beside the river below Balmoral. George asked whether his grandfather believed he was dangerous to the monarchy. The prince removed his coat, placed it around his son's shoulders, and explained that adults sometimes fear what they cannot control, even when the person involved has done nothing wrong. George then said he wanted no part of Glenn Cormac and offered to sign it back to Charles. William told him the decree forbade voluntary surrender before he turned 18. That restriction mattered because the Queen had protected George from making a permanent decision while frightened. Catherine arrived carrying the silver compass and revealed, through the trustees' recorded inventory, that the late monarch had left a message at the estate, explaining everything directly. George agreed to go, but only if Charles traveled beside him without lawyers, advisors, or Camilla. The boy everyone had been speaking about was finally ready to speak for himself, and his request would force a king to choose between authority and love. There were no courtiers in the car, no briefing papers between them, and no royal titles spoken during the journey. Charles sat beside George as a grandfather, not a sovereign. For miles, neither knew how to begin. Yet when the gates of Glen Cormac opened, and the Highland house appeared beyond the mist, the silence between them changed. They were no longer traveling toward an inheritance. They were traveling toward the Queen's final judgment. George walked into the estate chapel with Charles, while William, Catherine, and Anne remained outside. The choice mattered, because the boy had demanded one conversation without advisors, lawyers, or palace pressure shaping the words. A courtier is a member of the royal household who serves or advises senior royals, and none had been allowed near this moment. For once, the future of Glen Cormac rested on honesty rather than protocol. George placed the silver compass into a panel beneath the chapel lectern. The compartment opened with a click, revealing a recorded message and a handwritten letter addressed to George and the grandfather beside him. Charles recoiled. His mother had expected him to stand there, and the knowledge struck deeply. The king ignored the ceremonial chair and sat beside his grandson. The Queen's recorded voice filled the silence. She explained that Glen Cormac had never been designed as a rival court, meaning a competing center of royal influence. It was meant to give a future monarch one place where love, memory, and conscience carried more weight than rank. That mattered because a child raised only around power could begin mistaking obedience for trust, while a king without private refuge could lose sight of the people behind the crown. George looked at Charles and asked whether he resented him. The monarch answered honestly. He had resented being bypassed, not the boy who inherited the estate. Charles apologized for allowing fear of losing authority to make his grandson feel like a threat. George admitted he had wanted to reject Glen Cormac because every face in the chamber had looked unhappy when his name was read. The handwritten letter gave the estate its purpose. According to the Queen's recorded instructions, George was to open it to family reconciliation, youth charities, Highland communities, and royal retreats. He was never to turn it into a symbol of personal power. George offered his grandfather the larger chair. Charles refused and asked to sit with him on the chapel step instead. When they returned to Balmoral, the king held the boy's hand before the staff and cameras. The private wound had begun to heal, but outside the Highland gates, the world was already turning the inheritance into a national verdict. By sunrise, one image had traveled across Britain. The king, stepping from a car at Balmoral, with Prince George beside him, their hands joined and their faces solemn. The photograph silenced rumors of a permanent family rupture, yet it intensified fascination with the secret estate. To the public, Glencormack was no longer a private inheritance. It had become a symbol of continuity, childhood, memory, and the monarchy's uncertain future. Crowds gathered outside Balmoral, carrying flowers, handwritten cards, and small Scottish flags. Their presence mattered because the inheritance had moved beyond a private family dispute. People now saw George as the link between the Queen's memory and the monarchy's next generation. Support could steady him, but it could also turn a child into a public symbol before he understood the weight of that role. The Daily Chronicle captured the mood with a front page showing George beside Charles beneath the headline, "The Queen's Last Gift, a Kingdom of Conscience for the Boy Who Will Reign." A national broadcaster then described Glencormack as a sanctuary from the crown before asking him to carry it. The phrase spread quickly because it framed the estate not as privilege but as protection from the pressure surrounding future kingship. Catherine watched the coverage with George and noticed him tense whenever commentators called him the Highland heir. She switched off the television and reminded him that he remained her son before becoming anyone's symbol. The boy nodded, but the title had already entered public language, and that mattered because names could become cages when repeated often enough. William answered through a written palace statement, confirming that the estate would be protected by its trust and used according to the Queen's charitable and family wishes. A palace statement is an official message issued on behalf of the royal household, and his careful wording reassured the public without exposing the family's private conflict. The prince protected George while refusing to turn the inheritance into spectacle. Camilla initially refused to attend the public gathering, fearing her presence would be read as interference. Charles asked her to come not as a decision-maker, but as family. She agreed, though the queen consort remained guarded beside him. George approached the Balmoral gates and placed a handwritten card among the flowers. It read, "I will look after what she loved, and I will share it." Anne then announced through a recorded estate briefing that Glencormack's first gathering would include local children, tenant families, and the younger royals. That decision now waited inside Glencormack. The nation had already embraced the Queen's final gift, but only George could decide whether he was ready to carry its meaning. The final choice did not happen before cameras or beneath palace chandeliers. It happened inside Glencormack's modest council room, where George stood before his family, with the Queen's letter folded in his hands. He was still young, still uncertain, and still frightened by the weight of what had been placed upon him. Yet when he finally spoke, he transformed the inheritance from a source of division into a promise the entire family could share. George accepted Glencormack and its ceremonial guardianship, but he refused to treat the estate as a private kingdom. Ceremonial guardianship meant carrying responsibility for the property's traditions, charitable purpose, and family memory, without ruling over others. His decision mattered, because accepting the land preserved the Queen's final wishes, while rejecting personal power prevented the estate from becoming a rival center of royal influence. George approached the acceptance register and paused. The register was the official record confirming that he had accepted the inheritance and its obligations. William guided the page into place, but he did not guide the pen. Catherine stood behind their son, fighting tears as the boy slowly completed his name. The future king understood that protecting George could no longer mean hiding every burden from him. His wife understood something equally important. Duty must never be allowed to erase the child carrying it. Charles rose after the signature. Through a recorded statement prepared for the estate trustees, the king recognized the decree without qualification and promised that the crown would defend Glencormack's independence exactly as his mother intended. He no longer sounded bypassed. He sounded reconciled. The monarch had finally accepted that respecting the Queen's boundary did not weaken his reign. It proved that royal authority could honor limits. Camilla then told George she would respect the line drawn around the estate. The queen consort expected only a polite acknowledgement, but the boy invited her to the first family gathering. His offer created inclusion without surrendering control, ending the conflict without pretending the wounds had never existed. Anne carried the queen's letter into the stone archive and placed it inside its protected cabinet. The Princess Royal told George that guardianship was not about standing above people. It was about remaining when everyone else had left. He then announced that the chapel would become a permanent place of family remembrance, while the grounds would support Highland youth programs and local communities. The decree had not crowned George early, weakened Charles, or created a rival court. It had given the monarchy's future a place to learn responsibility without being consumed by power. Queen Elizabeth had left her great-grandson a test, and he passed it by choosing service over possession, reconciliation over resentment, and family over rivalry. And so Glen Cormac became not the estate that divided the monarchy, but the inheritance that reminded it why the crown was worth carrying at all. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.